Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Herbert C. Kellman Seminar on International Conflict. And my name is Donna Hicks. I'm the chair. And just before we go any further, I want to mention that this seminar is co-sponsored by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism, the Joan Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School, and the Boston area members of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. We are thrilled, to put it mildly, to have Congressman-elect Seth Moulton and Susan Hackley from the Program on Negotiation here for this final seminar of our semester. And as you know, the topic for today is why it's so hard to talk about war. Bridging the civilian-military divide. And before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to just give you a sense of what the format of the seminar is going to be. Susan will begin and address the topic for about 20 minutes, and following, Seth will address the topic for another 20 minutes or so. Hopefully they'll go a little bit longer than 20 minutes. And then I'm going to, for the rest of the time, we're going to open it up for a Q&A with you. So, and I'd also like to mention that we're going to be filming this session today. So if anyone who wants to ask a question doesn't feel comfortable being on camera, you can just sit behind. Here's Jody right here. You can just sit behind her. But otherwise, we'll assume that it's going to be okay with you. So, yes. The topic is why is it so hard to talk about war and bridging the civilian-military divide? And Susan will begin. Susan Hackley is the managing director of the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. And it's a consortium program of Harvard, MIT, and Tufts universities. A graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School, Susan's interests include the role of the media in shaping and reporting on conflict, and the overlap between the fields of negotiation and nonviolent action, arguably the two best methods humanity has developed for engaging constructively with conflict. It's nice, Susan. She co-founded an internet company, GivenNation.com, that enabled people to connect with causes they cared about. And she has worked as a policy analyst and speechwriter and served as communications director for the Massachusetts Democratic Party. Susan was chair of the Alliance for Peacebuilding in Washington, D.C. She's producing a documentary film called A Child's Guide to War about the impact of war on Americans' children and families. And you'll be seeing a little bit of it, just a little trailer today. So we're very excited about that. And Congressman-elect Seth Moulton who represents Massachusetts 6th District, covering the North Shore and eastern Merrimack Valley. Born and raised in northeastern Massachusetts, he attended Phillips Academy, Andover, and Harvard University on scholarships and student loans. After graduating from Harvard in 2001 with a degree in physics, Seth joined the United States Marine Corps, where he served 4 tours of duty in Iraq as an infantry officer between 2003 and 2008. Yes, please turn off your phones. That's a good reminder. After leaving the Marine Corps in 2008, Seth returned to Harvard and earned degrees from the Business School and Kennedy School of Government. Congressman-elect Moulton made veterans' health care a priority during his campaign and will continue to do so in Congress. So now, Susan.
Great, thank you. So many friends and wonderful people in the audience. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to start by just asking if you're a veteran or active duty military, would you raise your hand?
Sorry.
Great. Well, it's really wonderful to have you here today. I appreciate your coming, and I thank you so much. These seminars are more typically filled with the conflict resolution scholars and people
and
journalists, and it's wonderful to have military here. I'm honored to be engaging in this important topic that means a lot to me with Seth Moulton and with all of you. As Donna mentioned, I'm managing director of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School. And negotiation is a great process for helping people manage conflict, resolve problems, and bring people together who see the world differently. And that's really what we're doing here today, is bringing people together who sometimes see the world differently. We all start life as civilians, then some of us become soldiers. And then we don't seem to know each other anymore. So most of us remember the buildup of the war to Iraq in 2002. At that time, if you questioned the war, you were called unpatriotic, and it was difficult to have your opinions heard. That's not right. Whatever your views, people should be able to express opinions without being criticized and marginalized. Even the New York Times fell into that trap, not asking the hard questions and not giving a space for the dissident voices. And later they expressed really profound regret for their lopsided coverage. I remember this all vividly because as America was deliberating about whether to go to war, my son Zach, a young Marine infantryman, was on a ship headed to Iraq. Even now, it's still hard to talk about the war. It's hard to talk about the immense cost, the thousands of lives lost, the many more who are physically and emotionally injured, as well as the horrific loss of life, limb, and property to hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. And more fundamentally, if you haven't been to war, how can you really understand? What can you possibly say? Some soldiers have experienced really terrible things. How do we keep that sacred and also make it okay to talk about? Phil Clay is a Marine who fought in Iraq, just won the National Book Award for his short story collection, Redeployment. He said, "I can't think of a more important conversation to be having. War is too strange to be processed alone." In fact, there are taboos on so many levels that really prevent us from having an open and honest conversation about war. So as a consequence, many of us feel shut out of the conversation. And we want soldiers to know that people who don't serve in the military also care about this country. And we need to understand what the world looks like to a soldier. Of course, almost everyone is a family member, an uncle, a cousin, a father, a grandfather, a sibling who's been to war. When I talk to family members of veterans of World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they say they wish they could talk with their loved one about that experience. I realize as voters and citizens, it's we who collectively elect the leaders who make the decisions about when to go to war. Soldiers don't decide that. They sign up to serve, they're trained to fight, and we send them off to do that. It is remarkable that so many wonderful young people have faith in our democracy and put their trust in the leaders we elect to make decisions that can put them in harm's way. War is ugly and harmful to everyone. Wilfred Owen, a soldier in World War I, wrote of that tragic war as a time when blood had clogged their chariot wheels. Many soldiers I've talked to say they will grieve deeply and forever for their lost friends and for what they have experienced in war. Soldiers shouldn't have to bear the burden of war without our collective help. When our soldiers come home, we should ask, what can we do to help them pick up their lives as close as possible to where they left off? What can we do to show them we know that war is hard? How can we acknowledge what they've sacrificed? Most of the time, we don't know what to say, or we say the wrong thing. As I thought about how I could help prompt better conversations about war, I decided to focus on one under-acknowledged and important consequence of war. We hear about the soldiers, but we hear very little about their children and families. We see newscasts of soldiers coming home and being hugged by their children and young sisters and brothers. But what of the days after? How do they find work? How do they reintegrate into society and their families after being away at war? So I'm making a documentary film as a personal project called The Child's Guide to War, about the impact of war on America's children and families. I want to show you a rough cut of about 8 minutes of filming we've done so far just to give you a sense of the trauma many families experience when their loved one goes to war. Americans tend to think war happens somewhere over there, but we need to remember that the impact is also profound at home. There are nearly 2 million American children who have a parent who has been to war in Afghanistan or Iraq or both. For children 13 years or younger in this country, we've been at war their entire lives. So now we'll show the clip.
From sea to shining sea, oh beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain.
The second hardest job after ours is being the family of a soldier. I mean, not only do you have your everyday life to deal with, but you have to deal with that fact that that loved one is in danger, and knowing they're in danger, and you don't know if you're ever going to see or hear from them again until either they walk through the door or, you know, that black Cadillac pulls up and the chaplain steps out of it. I may be the one with the PTSD, but my family has to deal with the repercussions of my PTSD. My wife had to get drug out of bed and pushed under the bed because I was having a flashback and thought insurgents were coming through the door. My children had to see my angry outbursts and watch me get drunk and wonder why Dad's so angry and drunk all the time. It's because I was trying to escape reality.
We put up our Christmas tree a few weeks ago, and Ian actually asked if we could leave it up and leave the lights on so that Daddy can find his way home. Because I think he thinks he's lost.
When our nation goes to war, there are a variety of mental health issues, and many of those issues aren't exactly mental health diagnoses. There's a great deal of stress placed, of course, on the people serving in war, but their families serve with them.
It was always harder, I always felt it harder on the families because the families have to keep going on minus the soldier.
Most of the guys here are active duty and have multiple deployments, 3, 4, 5, 6 deployments. So a 6-year-old child may, you know, have seen their parent for a few months.
Listen, son, do you know what today is?
Thursday?
Well, yes, it is Thursday, but it's also that day we talked about. Remember, the day I have to go?
Oh, yeah. Daddy's gotta go away for lots and lots of days, right?
Military children serve alongside with their parents. If you ask people who are deployed what they think about those children.
What you got here?
I deployed early on, 2003 through 2004, and my daughter was 7 at the time.
This picture is me and my dad right when he got back from Iraq, and then my mom told me that he had to go back. That was really tough because I didn't want to say goodbye to him again after he already came back, because I love my dad so much and I would do anything to have him there all the time. So that was probably the hardest thing for me because I just wanted him to stay there, and I wanted to do so much with him. I wanted to show him my stuff, everything I've learned and stuff, and it was just really hard to say goodbye to him again.
And so when you hear 5 or 6, you know, deployments, this has never gone on before. And we're talking year-long and you know, in the beginning, 15-month-long deployments.
My mom actually kept a lot of it to herself. She didn't really like cry or anything in front of me because she didn't want me to get upset because I was already really upset about it.
I will never forget the day that we were actually at the grocery store, and an Air Force captain walks in, and Ian thought it was my husband. I mean, he goes running over to him. He's like, "Daddy, Daddy," and he looks at him, and this captain looks down at him, and he goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm not your daddy."
How long is that going to last for those children, and what consequences will it have?
When he says things to me like, "I'm just sad, I want him home," I don't know how to respond other than "me too." Because I do too. You know, this is my son, and I'm his mother. I'm supposed to protect him. That's my job.
Or is this a disruption that diverted their development a little bit and now they're kind of off course, and 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road we're going to see much more notable problem?
We've got 10 young people and 4 of them have parents who are in the military, and the rest of them have some questions for them. So who would like to be the first person to ask a question of either Darren or Marquise or Chloe or Luke?
Like, what's the worst part when your parents are away? Like, what's the worst part of it?
Like if you wrote a letter and we wrote back and we didn't hear from them for a while, kind of made me worry because I didn't know what was happening to them.
And you sometimes worry about them, like if they're still over there or if they're somewhere else and you don't know it.
And what, stay with us here, what do you do when you are worried about your mom?
I pray for her to see, I call her, she's all right.
Would people know, I mean, sure, they might see you praying or something, but would people know that you're worried about your mom, like your classmates? Would they have known that, man, Marquis really worried about his mom?
No.
We're really asking so much more of these families than we ever had, and I think in our country's history. It's not only just the length of the conflicts that have been going on. It's also the fact that never in our country's history have so few been asked to do so much.
These children were experiencing post-traumatic stress in relation to events that they were not personally on site to see.
So going to war is a much bigger issue than simply identifying a small group of people who come back who might have a certain diagnosis like PTSD. And to understand it and to approach it, we need a public health approach, not just a clinical approach in which we diagnose a certain illness, find those people who have it.
So the impact of war on children and families is important. But I just want to say what I believe is that war really affects all of us, even if we don't recognize it in our daily lives. And if there are people it doesn't affect, then as a country we're doing something wrong. So this film will be part of a campaign to talk about the true costs of war, including the impact of war on those who fight and their families, and what can the rest of us do to support them. We all know that without a draft in this country, many people feel disengaged from the military and war. The military says we have a better army because it's all volunteer, and that's probably true. But there's a cost to that in the lack of citizen engagement. A friend whose brother died in Vietnam said, "When my brother went to war, our whole family went to war with him. I would add there's a community that goes with him too, and we're all part of it. So I hope we can create a safe environment for talking about these tough issues, starting here. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and an honor to be a part of this discussion. Let me begin by just giving you a little bit of an introduction to me and some background to why I'm here, both in terms of why I'm here in this room, but also in terms of why I'm doing what I'm doing right now with Congress. So I grew up on the North Shore and had no family background in the military whatsoever. But when I was here as an undergraduate at Harvard, I had a couple of important mentors, and none more important than the Reverend Peter Gomes, who was a longtime minister in Memorial Church. And Reverend Gomes talked a lot about the importance of service, how it's not enough just to believe in service or support those who serve. You ought to find a way to try and serve yourself. And so when I got to senior year, I looked at different options. I looked at teaching overseas, I looked at the Peace Corps, but at the end of the day, I was 18 years old and I had 22 years old, and I had so much respect for the young 18 and 19-year-old kids who serve on the front lines of our nation's military that I decided that that's where I would like to do my part as well. Now, my timing was auspicious because I graduated in June of 2001. So I had no idea that September 11th would happen 3 months later. I ended up in the 1st Company of Marines into Baghdad. I was in the infantry with Zach, and even in the same company, because I wanted to serve in the front lines, and I wanted to understand and go through what so many young Americans have gone through throughout our history. And it was that experience in the war that ultimately led to my decision to run for Congress. Because in the war in Iraq, I felt like I saw some of the consequences of failed leadership in Washington. I think Washington didn't know what they were doing when they got us into Iraq, and they didn't have our backs while we were there. And that, more than anything else, is my motivation for wanting to serve the country again by going to Washington as a representative. Now, when I decided to serve, my parents had a different view about the military than I did. They had both been opposed to, they were both Brown, graduated in 1968 and 1970, so you can imagine what their views on the war were. My mother told me, and then later told the Boston Globe, that she would only have been more disappointed in Seth if he had chosen a life of crime. So maybe some mothers like Mrs. Meeks can identify with that. Jim Meeks was a classmate and a very dear friend of mine at Harvard who later joined the Army and served several tours in Iraq and was wounded over there. And I think that his parents share some of the feelings that my parents did of how difficult it was to have a son overseas. In fact, I actually really did not appreciate that experience until I was home for a few months while Jim was deployed. And that was the first time that I felt I really understood what it was like to be a parent or a friend back here wondering what was happening overseas. You know, when you're over there, you know when you're in danger and when you're not. But parents are worried the whole time. And they don't have any appreciation for what you're really going through every day because they can't understand it. And so in some ways I think that it's harder in terms of the fear to be a family member back home than it is to be someone over there. You know, there were discrete moments when I knew my life was in grave danger, but there were a lot of times when I was safely at the base and had nothing to worry about. But parents are worried the whole time. So that's a little bit of background to why I'm was just elected as an ex-congressman. I think it's important to think historically about this divide between the civilian and military world because it's not always been the same throughout American history. On the way over here, after I got off the T, we had a couple extra minutes, so I stopped in at Memorial Church, which was such an important influence in my young life. And it's a fascinating experience. I imagine most people here have been in Harvard's Memorial Church, but if you haven't, you should stop by, because you walk in, and Memorial Church was built in 1932 as a memorial to the Great War, the war to end all wars. And the church was designed with two entrances. So the riffraff from Cambridge could come in the main entrance now, but all the students would enter the church through the entrance facing Widener Library. And when you come in that entrance, you go first into the memorial room, which is an entire memorial to all the Harvard men who died in World War I. It has, across the top of that room, one of the most meaningful quotes that I have ever known, which is, "While a bright future beckoned, they freely gave their lives and fondest hopes for us and our allies, that we might learn from them the courage in peace to spend our lives making a better world for others." So the idea was that every Harvard student would read that quote and see those names on the wall every week, or perhaps even every day, when he came to church. Of course, just 10, 15 years after the church was built, they had to add this massive wall in the main sanctuary for all the Harvard men and women who died in World War II. And that's the memorial that most people see when they first walk in. But what's perhaps even more striking is that when you look to the right and see this massive memorial to World War II, you can then look to the left and see these very small bronze plaques for those who died in Korea and those who died in Vietnam. And I think that just being there in that room, you see in many ways represented how America's experience with war has changed just in the last 100 years. World War I and World War II were very democratic wars, where it didn't matter whether you went to Harvard or you didn't go to college at all, you probably were going to serve. And in fact, there was an expectation in society that if you had the opportunity to go to a place like Harvard, you should be the first to sign up. I know that was the case for my grandfather, who went to Brown, and it was very important for him to sign up before he was drafted into World War II. But of course, America's experience has been very different with our recent wars. And fast forwarding to today, 0.5% of America serves in Iraq or Afghanistan. And that creates a lack of understanding. Now, we've come a long way in some ways since Vietnam, because at least there's a lot of respect for the troops. One of the reasons why I have so much tremendous respect for the Vietnam generation is because people like Dr. Meeks came home from Vietnam and were not respected at all for their service. Today, a lot of Americans disagree with the war or really don't have any comprehension of what it's all about. But at least they generally support the troops. And it's made it a lot easier to be a veteran here today. When I was deployed to Iraq on my second deployment, I think, I was in touch with a lot of Harvard students who were interested. And there's one Harvard student who was a freshman at the time. He'd taken a couple years off before he started college. And I knew him pretty well. And he wrote to me about being, I think he lived in one of the dorms right, Massachusetts Hall, one of the dorms right in Harvard Yard. And he was quite a conservative guy. He's from out west and very supportive of what we were doing overseas. And very frustrated that so many Harvard students were opposed to it. So he wrote me, and this was back in the early days of the war when things were going very well. And he wrote this letter about how he was trying to get to sleep at night, but he couldn't go to sleep because there were people protesting outside his window. And he wrote about how frustrating it was and how much he disagreed with them, and he talked about their arguments and his, and how he was proud of what we were doing. But at the end of the letter, he said, but at least they care. As much as he disagreed with these protesters, he totally different political perspective on the war. He said, at least those people are out there and they care. Because he found the vast majority of his fellow students, of the people he ran into every day in Cambridge, had no idea what was going on in Iraq or Afghanistan and really didn't care. And I think that, more than anything, is about what is what this divide in America today is about. It's not necessarily a hostility. The hostility towards veterans is what we had after Vietnam or during Vietnam. Today, it's just a simple lack of understanding. And it's a lack of caring, maybe not in any deliberately mean or disrespectful way, but a lack of caring simply because we have no connection to what's going on overseas or to the veterans who are serving and doing that work. So how do we change that? Well, I think there are a lot of things that we can think about from a public policy perspective, but there are also things that we can do personally. Now, on a public policy level, one of the reasons why I've been such a proponent of national service is because I think that if we had national service in America, which doesn't mean a draft, and it doesn't mean that even there's a requirement that you do national service, but there's greatly expanded opportunities for national service so that young people feel like they have an obligation to serve their country. I think if we had that in America, more people would be bought in. One of the differences between this war and Vietnam is that in Vietnam, you had the draft, which in many ways was terrible. And everybody in America knew that he or someone that he or she loved could get pulled into the draft. And so people felt a very visceral connection to the war. And if you were drafted, you had to go over to Vietnam and do 13 months. But after those 13 months, someone else took your place. And that's not the case at all in these wars. I went back to Iraq 3 times after my initial deployment. And don't get me wrong, I was proud to go every time, and I was proud to go so that nobody had to go in my place and so that I could go and serve alongside my fellow Marines. But there is something a little bit undemocratic about that, even compared to the experience that we had in Vietnam. If we had a program of national service, I think that more young people would feel bought into the idea that we all have a role in serving our country. And it may not be in the military. I would not be an advocate for expanding the military under national service. I think you have to create national service opportunities through civilian service opportunities. But if every young man and woman in America felt that he or she had an obligation to do something, one of the incidental consequences is that the quality of the military would have improved because you'd have a lot more applicants. Some people would say, well, if I'm going to go do Teach for America, the Peace Corps, I'd rather just go into the Army or the Marines. But more importantly, I think it would create a sense of belonging and a sense of service and duty to America, which in many ways has been lost, I think, since the days of World War II, when people who lived in Harvard and Cambridge felt a real obligation to serve their country when the country was at war. On a personal level, I think that there's an awful lot of work to do to just help reach out to veterans and understand them and help integrate them into society when they come back home. There's a fascinating statistic that veterans are disproportionately CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and veterans are also disproportionately homeless. Now, how does that happen? Well, I think that the leadership skills that you are taught in the military are tremendously important and can be extremely a big part of success when you come back home in the civilian world. But if you can't make the transition and take those things that you learn from your service in the military and apply them to the civilian world, then you can literally practically fall off a cliff. And that's why we have so many veterans who are homeless. That's why we have such high veteran suicides. So the point is that veterans offer a tremendous opportunity for America. A lot of businesses find that they do extremely well when they hire veterans. But it is hard for veterans to bridge that transition, to bridge that divide, to make that transition when we come home. I found it myself when I came back to grad school. One of the reasons why it was an easier transition for me than for many other veterans is because Harvard actually does a pretty good job of taking care of veterans and actually attracting a lot of veterans, especially to the business school, where I think they really appreciate the leadership experience that we have in the military. And so when I came back to school here, I actually had a community of veterans. But many veterans come home in America today, and when half of 1% has served in a frontline role overseas, They don't have a community of veterans. They don't have anybody to share the experiences they have gone through with. And so they feel very, very alone. And of course, you can imagine why we have high rates of suicide. There's a lack of appreciation, I think, in America today for what veterans have done overseas and what they can bring home. One of the things I remind people on the campaign trail is that we have so much respect for the greatest generation, World War II. But the greatest generation is not a term that was coined in 1946. That term wasn't coined until the 1990s. And so it had as much to do with what the greatest generation did after the war as what they did in it. When I was at the business school across the river, we had a course on leadership. And at one point I talked about one of the greatest leaders that I've ever met in my life. And his name is Corporal Van Wy from my platoon, Greg Van Wy from Ankeny, Iowa. Now, Greg grew up in this farm town in Iowa, and, you know, was a B student. He was on the football team, but he sat on the bench. Pretty unremarkable by standards of success in America today. But he joined the Marines, and he was in my platoon, and he is hands down one of the best leaders I've ever met in my life. If I ever had trouble with one of the Marines on my platoon, I'd put him in Van Wy's team, and he'd turn him right around. And I explained to my Harvard Business School classmates that Greg Van Wy is the kind of person who could be this dark horse candidate to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company someday. He is the kind of person that I would want by my side if I was ever in a difficult situation. And when I said that, when I said Greg is the kind of person that I would want to turn to, even back here, not just overseas, there were a lot of nodding heads and a lot of smiling faces in my classroom. And from the comments, I got to appreciate that people thought it was quite nice and meaningful, that I cared so much about my Marines that I would want to hire them when I came home. Because I said, Greg's the kind of person I would hire for my company. And so I had to interrupt and just said, no, you don't understand. I don't want to hire Greg because he's a fellow veteran. I want to hire Greg because he's better than you at leadership. But that's lost on a lot of Americans because we simply don't understand what veterans have been through, what they bring to the table when they come home. So I think that there are some things that we can do from a policy perspective to change the dynamic in America today, to make more Americans feel bought in to serving their country, to help more Americans understand what that service means, and to also make sure that we don't go into wars that we shouldn't get involved in. How many people here today think that if most members of Congress had a son or daughter serving in the military, we would have invaded Iraq?
No, Bernita.
We would have. We would have. Almost maybe one. Almost none. I don't think we would have. I do think we would have gone into Afghanistan. So I'm not saying that simply having sons or daughters in the military would make our national leaders turn into peaceniks. But I think we'd be a lot more careful. I think we'd be a lot more careful. And one more comment on national service. When I came home from Iraq, my last deployment in 2008, I started school here, and one of the first trips I took was to New York for a conference on national service. And it was the only time in the 2008 campaign that Senator Obama and Senator McCain made a joint appearance. The only time. They were on the same stage together, and they were both advocating for national service. But my memory of that experience was how much commonality I found among the veterans and among the veterans of other national service, military veterans and other national service veterans. How much my experience serving overseas in Iraq was similar in some fundamental ways to the young people who would go down to serve in difficult schools in New Orleans for Teach for America, or the people who had been walking the streets of Boston in City Year. We shared the same fundamental principles. The foundations of our experience were very similar. So even though we did very different things on the surface, we shared common values that have been instilled in us and I think will carry for the rest of our lives. So that's why I think there would be some value in national service. So with that, should we open to questions?
Wait a minute. What was it about Greg? You have to give us at least a little nugget about what it was about Greg.
I don't know that I can just pin on one thing, but I think Greg had a remarkable understanding of people. He could inspire people who were pretty uninspired. He could relate to people in a way that engendered tremendous respect, and he could therefore get them to do things that they were otherwise unwilling to do. He was smart. He had good judgment. He was decisive. He had tremendous courage, and his judgment and decision-making were not adversely affected under some of the most difficult circumstances you can imagine, like people shooting at you. Those are all things that made him a great leader. And they're things that matter even in the civilian world. When you go through a campaign, it matters to have people around you who can make tough decisions and make the right judgment calls, even when things are not going your way. When you have some really bad press, or this guy makes a mistake, right? That's tough for the team. So a lot of the same, no one ever shot at us on the campaign trail. So it was not as stressful as being in Iraq. Don't get me wrong. But it's a stressful experience. And so my point is that in the same way that I think Greg, would be a good leader in a political environment, I think he could be a good leader in a business environment. But he's a leader of people.
Thank you. So before we open it up, is there anything you would like to comment on, Susan? Or Seth, is there anything you would like to say about Susan's presentation?
I mean, it's fantastic what you're doing, because it's very, very important. And I have spent a tremendous amount of time since I have been back just trying to help other veterans where I can. And I haven't done nearly as much as I would like. I haven't done nearly as much as some other veterans have. But especially my second platoon, we went through a lot, and we're very, very close. We have a Facebook group, so we literally talk almost every day. And we help each other through some of these difficult times. But we've lost 2 guys since we've come back. And so it's not been easy, and it's not always been successful.
So when my son came back from Iraq, he moved into our basement with 3 of his buddies so they could still be together. And they got jobs in Starbucks and sort of started to re-enter America. But hearing what you say about your frustration or displeasure with the government and the way they made decisions to go to Iraq, and how I know my son felt, that's got to make it just so much harder to fight that war when you don't believe that it's a necessary war.
It does, but I don't think it actually has as much effect as most people think. And this is probably one of those issues that's just hard to understand, I think, from the civilian perspective. Because when you're there on the ground, you really care about doing the best job that you can with the circumstances you've been given, of doing the best job that you can so that nobody else has to do the job, and of taking care of the guys next to you. And maybe that sounds sort of silly and romantic or something, but that actually really matters. I didn't agree with the Iraq War, but I had a lot more influence over how that war was fought and executed by being in Iraq than by being back here complaining about it. Mm-hmm. My work every single day in Iraq impacted the lives of other people. I haven't had a job like that since, and I don't know that I ever will.
Okay, thank you. Quite honestly, I've been chairing this seminar for over a decade, and I can't remember feeling as moved as I am today with these 2 speakers, so I just want to thank you both. Very powerful, very powerful. So if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, just indicate to me, and then I'll write your name on a list, and you'll need a mic, so remember to wait for the, do you want to, and before you make your comment, would you please identify yourself? Yes,
My name
we
is
are.
David. I'm a future constituent. Thank you for coming. You mentioned an interesting metaphor when you talked about buy-in. Let's get a little more literal and talk about money and who pays for wars. You hadn't mentioned that. When I think about World War II, among many things, I think about a 90% income bracket, and I think about war bonds. Can you talk a little bit about what would happen if people actually had to pay for war? And what would happen if every congressperson had to buy a war bond for their particular campaign?
I didn't mention that, but I should have. And the issue is, as I was talking about this yesterday, it's one of the things that came up, and I just neglected to mention it. This is the first war in American history where we haven't had some sort of war tax to pay for it. This is a war where our president at September 11th told everybody on September 12th to go shopping, that was the way that Americans could contribute to the war effort. I certainly felt, especially in the early days when I was deployed, that a lot of people wanted to support me in some way, but weren't even presented with options. You know, the best we could do is my sister organized an email list and said, these are some of the things that Seth needs, so you can go get a box and put them together. It was, I guess, expected when she said, you know, you can send him some shampoo or some, you know, baby wipes was the classic, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that were good over there. You know, some
magazines,
trail mix or nuts or magazines or whatever. I think it was more surprising when she would explain, well, that's not the kind of magazines he needs. He needs magazines that the U.S. government should be giving him, but the ones he gives them are so bad they jam, and so he and his fellow Marines want good magazines.
Yes, Paul.
Thank you, Seth.
Identify yourself.
My name is Paul Henry. Susan and I were at an event with David Gergen, and David Gergen made a comment that has resonated with me, and you've reminded me of it today. He said that when you take the World War II generation being in Congress, because no matter what their political differences were, because they had fought in a war together for the country, that they felt the sense that they needed to come together and to do things to serve the country because they were more selfless because they had made that kind of sacrifice before and that kind of service before. And that the fact that people don't serve in the military or in any other way for national service, that even though in some sense, of course, they're performing a public service by being elected to a political office, they felt that there was some bottom line aspect of having fought in a war that made Congress work better, and that or some other kind of national service might replicate that. And I'd just be curious to have you comment about that.
Well, from all my experience in Congress, I would say that's true. I mean, I haven't even been sworn in yet, and although we have a Congress with fewer veterans than Congress has ever had in American history, we've never had fewer veterans in Congress than we do today. It is mostly veterans who have reached out to me from across the aisle. There's been a handful of Republicans who have reached out to me and said they'd like to work with me. I think 2 through just personal connections, 1 a Harvard connection, 1 a high school Andover connection, and all the rest are veterans. So I think that is probably true. You know, I didn't have a platoon of all Democrats. In my platoon, we had Marines from all over the country. I had a couple of Marines from Massachusetts, from Vermont, but also from Alabama and from Texas, you know, from California, from a gated community outside of Park City, Utah, and from inner city Brooklyn, New York. And we came together with remarkably different backgrounds, different religious beliefs, different political beliefs, but at the end of the day, we had to set aside those differences to do what's best for America. And fundamentally, I think that's what Americans expect of Congress as well. You know, there are 435 different representatives from around the country, many with very different constituencies. But you ought to come to Washington and be able to do what's best for the country.
Maybe national service would help with that.
I think it would tremendously, because national service is the same way. You don't have a city year platoon with all Democrats or all Republicans, right? You learn to work with people who share some fundamental values. And I do think that experience would be valuable in Washington.
Okay, yes. Would you please identify yourself? could I do?
Jay Livingston. I have a couple of questions about some of the comments you made. First, I'm still not clear on your motive for going to Iraq. You seem to be making some sort of vague connection between 9/11 and Iraq, even though no hard evidence has ever been established to equate the two or to connect the two. And secondly of all, you seem also to believe that by being in Iraq, you could do more than not by being in Iraq. But during the Vietnam era and in other times, there have been conscientious objectors, people that have refused to serve. They could also be doing more for the countries that were illegally invaded, as many people might believe, by not being there at all and by not taking part in what many people would feel to be an unwarranted, unauthorized, and even criminal act of aggression. Now, would you say that by taking a principled stand and not serving in Iraq, you could be doing at least as much or more for the people of Iraq than you could by being there in a misguided policy?
Sir, thank you. So first of all, on 9/11 in Iraq, whatever implications are there are entirely your own construction. I've never said anything connecting 9/11 to Iraq, and I certainly don't believe they're connected, and it had nothing to do with my motivations for going. I decided to serve the country before 9/11. I decided that I wanted to do my part to serve this country, and when I looked at different options, I had tremendous respect for those who served in the military, and that's why I signed up. So that was my motivation to serve. With regards to conscientious objectors, I do think that there is a role for conscientious objectors. I support that position if you take that principled stand. I actually disagree with you. I don't think that a conscientious objector can do as much to influence the outcome of a war, or influence the people of Iraq in this case, than someone who's willing to go and be a part of the effort. So that's a difference of opinion, and we can certainly have that difference of opinion, but I would just say again that every single day I was in Iraq, I had a tremendous effect on the lives not just of my fellow Americans, but on the Iraqis. It's why I have so many dear Iraqi friends, many of whom I've helped come to America because they've been so persecuted since we left. So saying that lends no credibility to the war, the decision to go to war, but in terms of my own decision to participate in it, I felt that I was able to have a positive influence.
Okay, thank you. Bob?
I heard someone who I thought was a wise person say that we've got to be much more serious and careful about when we get into a war, but we also have to be much more serious and careful about how we leave a war. And I wonder if you have any observations about the wisdom of our policies at the end when we at least initially left Iraq.
That's Bob Mnookin from the law school.
I couldn't agree more with that statement. And I think we've made a lot of mistakes getting out of Iraq. And I think it's very important today that we learn from those mistakes so that we don't repeat them in Afghanistan. And this is something that, I'll tell you, you're not supposed to say this as a Democrat because obviously it's under President Obama's watch that we've gotten out of Iraq. But I've been very outspoken about some of the mistakes that I think he's made. I think that in many ways some of the chaos that we see in Iraq today with ISIS it's not necessarily our fault, but it wouldn't have happened if we had made those decisions more carefully. When Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus came back from the surge and reported to Congress, they basically said two things. They said, militarily, the surge has been tremendously successful, far exceeded our expectations. But politically, we have not made as much progress as we need. And so the prescription was, it's okay to start withdrawing combat troops, but we've got to provide more political and diplomatic support to the Iraqi government. We built the largest American embassy in the world in Baghdad, and then we left it half full. And what happened? The government under Prime Minister Maliki became so viciously sectarian that they lost the faith and support of their people and even their army. And that's ultimately why ISIS was able to invade Iraq, right? I mean, ISIS did not come in and just defeat the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army put their weapons down and went home. because they had lost faith in their government. And so fundamentally, the problem in Iraq today is not a military problem. It's a political problem. That's why I would have been much happier if President Obama had immediately sent 300 political advisors to Iraq than military advisors, because I think at the end of the day, you've got to fix the political problem so that the Iraqi army can do its job. If we go in and solve this military problem for the Iraqis, I guarantee you we'll be back solving it again for them 2 or 3 years down the road. So I've been outspoken even during the campaign about my concerns with our present policy, very militarily focused in Iraq, and the implications to how, for how we pull out of Afghanistan based on the mistakes that I think we made when exiting Iraq.
Okay, thank you. Right here.
Yes. I have a son.
Could you please identify yourself?
Sorry. Oh, Martha Jackson. I have a son who joined the Army 4 years ago, and he's done 2 tours in Afghanistan. He's back, and he's was invited to train with Special Forces, and so he's now in the process of that. It's a departure for anyone in our family and for his peer group. Most people don't understand, and I think from my personal experience, they don't respect the decision. I have very few friends who are genuinely interested in what he's doing. There's a dichotomy, I think, that is being highlighted here that is anchored in some of the facts that were brought forward, the percentage, this tiny percentage of people who serve, and it's probably a tinier percentage of those from a particular background that would find themselves here. And the us-them is a very polarizing thing, and I think one of the most significant aspects is that most people I know don't want to know. So I think that's a hurdle, and I think this film, these conversations, will go a long way to changing that. But I think the time is now and before. I'm very disappointed in the political leadership. I'm disappointed in President Obama that he didn't make a huge departure from George Bush, who said go shopping, but we haven't been told ways, there isn't a language there. You're beginning something that's going to help us move into an understanding of what the military folks do, what price they pay, who they are, why they do what they do. The fact is we need a military. And that's just, but I don't think there's any courses in high school or college that I'm aware of that says what is the role, and as citizens, emerging citizens who are starting to vote, how are you going to weigh on this issue of if there's a need for our military, how are you going to influence that? I mean, in one instance, I'll just tell you, my son going into Special Forces is a scary proposition. But sometimes we're told that war is horrible and everybody should be for peace. On the other hand, what about the Yazidis who are at the top of the mountain, and suddenly we want our Special Forces in there to help them out? It's humanitarian, it's sometimes necessary. How are we going to get that understanding across, that we're going to need a military? We're going to need them to preserve our borders and protect us. We're going to need them for lots of different reasons. And I think the closer we get and the more we have a language for it and we feel connected to it, we'll head in that direction to making good decision makers and informed, engaged citizens talking about the military and understanding it.
Well, thank you. I mean, do you want to go ahead?
Let me just add that, so in 2002, 2003, when my son was in war in Iraq, I had nobody to talk to. And I wish then I'd sort of found some, because there are a few people around Cambridge, and so it's very lonely. It's very traumatic for a mother to have a child at war, and what Seth said, you worry all the time. And I think what you say is exactly right. We should start teaching children about war in age-appropriate ways. And in New York City, they recently decided that it would be okay for teachers in 3rd grade and on up to start teaching children about war. When somebody in this country is 18, they can join the military, they can vote for the leaders who make these decisions. So I would hope that would happen. And we're working with Diane Levin, who's from Cambridge, who's done a lot of work writing about children and trauma and war, and she's developing a curriculum to go with this film to help parents and teachers talk about war in the right way. So people still ask me, so it's 12 years later, they'll still ask me about my son, and you know, I know the only thing they know about him is he went to war. It's sort of stuck in their minds, and is he still in the Marines? Is he, you know, and it's because very few people had any other point of reference. And I think what we can do here is start to get to know some soldiers and some veterans. They're wonderful people. And
I'll just add, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. It's wonderful comments. I'll just add another perspective on this, too, which is that some people from different parts of the country will listen to your comment and say, well, that's a pretty Cambridge problem, because there are a lot of places in America where we really do appreciate what the military does. But there are also a lot of places in America where we don't appreciate what the State Department does. And I think one of the challenges that I see, you know, going into being a small part of this foreign policy establishment is that in America today we're very quick, we have a very good military, and we're very quick to find military solutions to various problems, and it's a lot harder at times to find diplomatic solutions. We don't have the State Department that we did 30 years ago. You know, when you go to southern Afghanistan today, there is a lot of support, even in these small villages, for America. But it's not because there are American troops keeping the Taliban at bay today. It's not because American troops have made it possible for little Afghan girls to go to school. It's because in the 1950s and 60s, we built their agricultural system in southern Afghanistan through USAID. And those are important instruments of American foreign power as well. And yet, the State Department is historically underfunded. They've been very ineffective, I think, in large part in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we need support for those instruments of U.S. foreign power as well. And at the end of the day, we'll be a much stronger, more successful country if we can choose from a panoply of options when it comes to dealing with the crises in Iraq, Syria, in Iran, in Ukraine, than if we just always turn to the military. I mean, look what the debate over Syria happened. When Syria crossed the red line and used chemical weapons, we had several different options from General Dempsey and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You know, we could shoot cruise missiles into downtown Damascus. We could, you know, give more support to the CIA effort. We could put special forces in on the ground in Syria. Well, where were the diplomatic options? Where was someone talking about overt support to the refugee camps, which would have actually helped the people afflicted by the chemical weapons quite directly, and I think would have been a more effective political blow against Assad? But those options weren't even on the table. So this is a broad conversation that I think in some ways does come back to the value of national service, and for more Americans recognizing the importance of the people and the institutions that carry out our policy overseas.
Okay, so we have a long list. You're next, followed by you, and then you, and then the person back there, and you. Oh my goodness. Okay.
Well,
all right.
Sorry, we'll try to be shorter.
No, all right. So let's just start with that and see how we get to.
My name is Bob Loftus, and as a former State Department officer for 32 years, I got to thank you very much for those comments. And we can talk about at some point proper civil-military relations. But I really welcome this conversation. But to me, one of the most difficult things we have right now is, for lack of a better term, almost a trivialization of our discussion about this. So it comes into thank you for your service. It comes into putting a yellow sticker on the back of your car that says, I support the troops, and then it doesn't go anywhere from there. And I think part of what needs to happen is, in many ways, is a little bit more, is understanding that people that we're talking about are actually human. You know, they're not superheroes. Some of them have been very heroic. Others, you know, but they are normal human beings. And we can't have a conversation about our military if every time we start it, we have to say, we have the greatest military in the world. It's almost as if we've gotten to the point where on our broader topic, we can't be critical. And I think if we're going to use our military properly, we actually have to be critical about some of the things that it does, some of the ways that our military treats people, PTSD, those sort of things, and not be as walking on eggshells, I guess I should say.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the military's handling of post-traumatic stress has been terrible, and I could give my own personal stories to emphasize that or to prove it, but I think you've all heard stories, and we'll see more from your film. The reality is that the military is not perfect, and I think that, on a very personal level, look, this is what happened to me when I got to be 18, 19, 20 years old and suddenly had this interest in serving. And it had a lot to do with the fact that growing up, you hear about war as this sort of distant historical thing. And those who fought in wars were these sort of mythic figures from your parents' or grandparents' generation. And then all of a sudden I realized, wow, these are kids just like me who just decided to serve. And I think that happening at the same time that Reverend Gomes was talking about service is what really got my interest in serving the country in that way.
I would just add that we hear a lot about PTSD and what a problem it is, and it's good that we're hearing about it. I think the downside of that is it makes a lot of people think so many people coming back have PTSD. Do I hire them? Do I invite them back into, because you don't always hear the good stories.
That's absolutely right. This has been a huge problem for sort of veterans organizations who are on the one hand trying to make every veteran recognize that it's okay to have post-traumatic stress because it's pretty normal. In fact, I really make a point of calling it PTS, because as a young Marine in my platoon said once, for all that we went through, you'd have a disorder if you weren't affected by what you saw, right? So it's also an entirely curable disease. It's a curable problem. It's something that just needs the proper attention. So on the one hand, veterans organizations are working hard to make people recognize that this is okay to have post-traumatic stress and you can go take care of it. It's okay to go to the doctor and say, I think I've got this problem, because then you can fix it. But at the same time, all this publicization has made it a problem for the rest of America, who gets nervous that every veteran must, regardless of age or experience or anything else, must have post-traumatic stress. Or if he or she had it in the past, he or she must have it today, and that's just simply not true.
Yeah, it's a normal reaction to an abnormal experience.
Right.
You know what you might do is just take a number of questions, because I know Seth can't stay too long. And then we can
Okay, so on that note, and then we will move to you, and then up here, and then David, and then Susan's sister, and then you, and then Paula.
All right.
We'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Quick questions.
Thank you. My name's Steve Rosen. I teach a course on war and politics where I try to teach Harvard undergraduates about the sociology of combat. I also participate in the Warriors to Scholars program, where we help combat veterans try to reintegrate themselves into college.
Amazing program.
And it's a terrific program. I'd like to ask all of the members of the panel for your help. It would be a great thing if we had national service. The political obstacles to it are very large. It'll be a while before we have it, if we ever have it. In the meantime, I think we probably agree that ROTC is a good way to increase the interaction between the American military and American universities. Unfortunately, ROTC enrollment at Harvard has fallen precipitously, despite the recent movement to better integrate ROTC into Harvard. It's partly the result of the desire of the services, while they downsize, to reduce their costs, draw more from the service academies, put less money into ROTC. It's also partly the result of lingering distrust or unhappiness with the American military and the universities. I'd like to ask all of you, if you have the time, to work with me and the head of the Student ROTC Association, Charlie Folletta, who has been trying to work against this tendency to actually get fewer Harvard students enrolled in ROTC as opposed to more. And if there's anything, Seth, that can be done in Congress to encourage the services to reach out to encourage and expand ROTC nationally, I think it would be a partial step on the way, perhaps, to national service. So this is a request for help.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to make two quick comments on that, Professor Rosen. And you know much more about the statistics behind this than I do, but there are two other causes that I think are related to this decline. The first is Harvard's handling of ROTC scholarships. You know, if you go and have an evening job in the library and you make some income off of that, that doesn't count against the scholarship that you get to come here, the financial aid you get to come here. But if you get an ROTC scholarship for getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and going to train at MIT every day, they just subtract that from your financial aid. So that's a fundamental inequity that I think needs to be fixed. The second thing I think is related to this is just the proliferation of helicopter parents and the increasing tendency of parents to make decisions for 18-year-olds and the students themselves. But I don't know how we change that.
Harvard undergraduates do not get course credit for ROTC courses, and that means on top of the extra time they have to put in, they don't get any recognition for the studies that they pursue.
Okay, so you're next. Yeah, we really have to try to make these a little bit shorter.
My name is
Thanks.
Oliver Ofcha. I'm a fellow at the Weatherhead Center, in real life a German diplomat, and I spent 2 years in Afghanistan before coming here. And first of all, thank you for this excellent event this afternoon. I wanted to, as a non-American, I wanted to ask you on the perception being an American military abroad with your international partners, which sometimes is a liberator, sometimes as an ally, and sometimes as a suppressor. And how has this been? And would you believe that a little less American-led wars and a little bit more internationally conducted engagements would be more beneficial for all parties?
I think it'd be hard to find an American who doesn't agree with that, whether in the military or in the civilian world. So I think that I've had a lot of experience working with our international partners in Iraq. Some of it very good, some of it not so good, but overall, I mean, this is probably its own separate seminar discussion. But there's a lot to be said for what you just said. I unfortunately have to make this my last question because I do have to get to.
I'll try to be quick. Appreciate you being here. Firstly, I do work for a program. I am a veteran. I work for a program run by Mass General that offers tremendous support to
home base?
veterans and family members. That's correct. So anybody in the audience who would like to speak with me afterwards, I encourage you to do so. But switching gears, I just kind of wanted to ask you briefly, you know, one of the things when I got back both times and, you know, family and friends would, you know, be curious about how it was, but would be, you know, very worried about asking that kind of thing. Well, I would tell them to read these, you know, these couple books I read that kind of captured it. And actually, when I started working with the program, I went out and I bought in bulk copies of both of David Finkel's books, The Good Soldiers and Thank You for Serving, for everybody in the clinic. I said, you just need to read these. And in addition to other, you know, other books like Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk and a couple others, you know, what's interesting to me is that, at least from my perspective, these books, fiction and nonfiction, capture the experience better than any film, and yet, you know, they don't get the widespread, you know, media attention. You know, I would say more people have seen and certainly know about a film like The Hurt Locker, which every veteran I know thinks is a travesty of a film. But I'm interested in your perspective on how we can, you know, maybe promote books like this more, get them more into the mainstream culture. I don't know if it's a larger, more complicated issue, but it is interesting to me how, you know, little attention they get when in reality they do the best job of kind of cutting to the truth of a lot of these issues.
Well, someone was asking me just yesterday, actually, what makes a good war movie? And, you know, my degree from Harvard is in physics, so I don't think I'm very well qualified to answer that question. But to me, a lot of the war movies that get attention are the ones who are able to accurately portray the violence, right? But what really makes a good war movie is a movie that's able to capture the emotion. Because at the end of the day, being in war is an incredibly emotional experience. This is why veterans have so much difficulty talking about it with other people. When I think back on the things that the images that I have from my experience in the war, the ones that stick with me are not the most gruesome, the most violent. They're the most emotional. Sometimes with my fellow troops, sometimes with the Iraqis. And you think about, you know, an interesting movie to think about in this frame or in this context is Saving Private Ryan. When Saving Private Ryan, which I think is widely and I think rightly acclaimed as quite a good film, came out, there was a lot of discussion about how these initial scenes going onto the beach at D-Day, and how it was such a bold film in being willing to show the American public how truly violent it was. But the essence of that film was about all the emotions wrapped up in this story of, you know, risking these American lives to save this one kid just because his brothers had died. You know, and that's the part of war that is really meaningful, and that's what makes that a great film. So thank you very much for having me. This is a fascinating discussion. I'm so sorry that I have to leave, but it's an honor to be on this panel. Thank you so much.
Yeah, join me in thanking them. Thank you so much. Thank you. We have one more. We have Susan, our speaker, also. So if anybody would like to ask questions and direct them towards Susan, please, we're going to.
Also, if anyone would like to leave, now that's
No. No, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm sure we can. Yes, please. Thank you again.
I just wanted to thank you for the showing us that footage. It is extremely moving. And so my question really is what your plans are to roll it out, and then if you were to look at things 5 or so years from now, what would success look like for you as a result of that work that you're doing?
Oh my goodness. Well, tomorrow I go to Indiana for 3 days of filming, including filming U.S. Senator Joe Donnelly, who's on the Armed Services Committee for Indiana. So making what we expect will be a 30-minute public television program of A Child's Guide to War, Indiana version. Somebody once said to me, when you make a film, you just keep making a bigger film. So my first trailer was 4 minutes. This one's 8 minutes. Hope to have a 30-minute Indiana version, and then hope to raise the funds to make a full-hour public television or a film for theatrical release. We had a Kickstarter campaign that was successful, so that's how we've gotten to this point. But for me, success would be if this really became a conversation nationally. Mm-hmm. If other people would think, this is a great idea, I want to start something. A friend of mine said yesterday, one of my book club friends who's not here, but 2 of them are here, we should start a reading group with veterans and non-veterans. We read some books together, we talk about it, we see how we see those pieces of literature together. Just lots of different little things where we get to know each other. And Cambridge is different than the rest of the country.
You think?
But as Seth said, different in other ways. As he said, in some parts of the country, they don't care much about diplomacy. So I hope eventually there'll be people all over the country coming together, whether it's through national service or conversations, public conversations projects, something like that, and that we get that dialogue going. I think this disconnect shouldn't exist. The benefits to us knowing and respecting and understanding each other are immense for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, for our decision-making process, for how we talk to our leaders who trivialize and marginalize and really have, in my view, pretty dysfunctional conversations about going to war. And the recent example of Syria, you know, whether you bomb or not bomb, that those very little space for the people who wanted to talk about diplomatic options. They weren't respected as much as I think they should have been.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And you must identify yourself.
My sister.
Yes.
Rosalie Anders.
Rosalie Anders. I was a peace activist during the Vietnam War in the Village in New York City, which is a pretty liberal place. And in fact, what happened in the Village was that peace activists put together a center for returning vets. I don't think there was anybody in New York that was more concerned about what was happening to Vietnam veterans, in fact, than peace activists. And that may not have been true elsewhere in the country, but it was certainly true there. And when people talk about how, you know, the veterans were scorned and so forth, that, you know, that was not the experience that I saw in New York with the peace movement. And that brings me to the thing about right now. where I think it's, and I'd say it's still a peace activist, and a bunch of us are here, that in a way the natural alliance is between the people who have had the experience of war and the peace movement, because we are the ones who are really paying attention. And that a lot of what we're up against is a kind of indifference about what's going on. So I think that's where we can all work together.
I think that's such an important point. And someone told me recently, I don't know, Maggie, if it was you or somebody else, that about in New York City, in Times Square, so somebody set up a tent, and the sign said, "Come talk to a veteran." And you could walk inside the tent, and there'd be a veteran sitting there, and you'd have a conversation. And that lots of people went through. And you know, maybe some ways it was silly, maybe some ways it was profound, but a lot of people had that experience.
Cole Harrison. The mission of the U.S. military has changed so much since World War II that I don't think you can even compare it. There's no reason to think that the mission of invading Afghanistan or Iraq or now the bombing in Syria really reflects a deep democratic impulse of the American people, or that there would be any basis of support for that. So I think, honestly, we're missing the elephant in the room in terms of why there might be a disconnect between veterans and civilians. People are complaining that civilians are disengaged. Well, yeah, they're disengaged because that war was not their war.
But
and
we
as a country shouldn't be going to war. Of course, they do whip up outrage and 9/11, and they whip up fury, and for a time the public will support a xenophobic war effort, but it fades. It fades as they see what's really happening. It always does. The people turned against the war in Afghanistan. They turned against the people in Iraq, the war in Iraq, and it will definitely turn against this ridiculous ISIS war too. So if we think we can just look at that as bridging the gap, it's impossible. You have to look at the fundamental issues. Of course, a 2-year-old in your film cannot understand that. That's a timeless image of where's my father. In any war, in any time period, you could have taken a picture of that kid. But that teenager, that's different. That teenager understands, or has a basis to understand, why there's such a disconnect. And that's the real story here.
Well, I agree about the war in Iraq being a misbegotten war, from my view. And my son went there and with the first troops into Baghdad. I don't want this project to be about revisiting the Iraq war. I want to look forward and think, how can we do better in this country the next time something like that comes up? And the people who are against the war aren't on CNN. They aren't being listened to. They're not on the front page of the Times. Remember Cindy Sheehan? Her son died in the Iraq war, and she parked herself outside of the ranch at Crawford, Texas, and people made fun of her because she was trying to say to George Bush, I'm against this war. So my purpose is that we do better next time, and that all of us who care about peace and not fighting wars that we don't think need to be fought have more clout, that our voices are heard, that we're not looked at as sort of a marginal group of peace activists. So that's exactly what I want to do. And in negotiation, we talk about separating the people from the problem. And as I said in my remarks, the soldiers don't decide where to go to war. They decide to serve, and they don't know where they'll be sent when they first sign up. When my son joined the Marines, it was before 9/11. As Seth joined the Marines before 9/11, my biggest concern, this is true, was how is he going to get a girlfriend? You have to go back to 2002. There was no thought that we would be at war. It was sort of a boring time politically. And then all of a sudden we're in one war and a second war. So we don't know what's ahead of us. But I believe that if we start talking to each other, understanding each other, appreciating each other, and I have such great appreciation for all these young people who sign up for service, that we won't be marginalized as people on the far left.
Paula? Wait a second. Paula, hold on. You need a mic.
I just want to follow up Cole's wonderful comments and your wonderful comments. Thank you so much for what you're doing, Susan. This is really important. And I'm reminded of the fact that in 1986 or something like that, when we were thinking about the nuclear arms race and the threat of nuclear war, and an organization that I was connected with had put out a book called Breaking the Taboo, No Reason to Talk About It. Talk to your families about nuclear war. And it was about that there was a taboo about talking about nuclear war, and until we talked about it, we couldn't start to think about how to stop it. Maybe it was 83. I don't remember. At any rate, so I think talking about war and making it a non-taboo subject makes it real and helps us all think about what it is that we're doing and brings it home. So I think bringing it home in this way is an important function for the health of our society. Thank you.
David, if you could just move it down here. Yeah.
My name is David Rosenberg. I think this was successful today in convincing me that there was a bigger problem than I realized there was, but it wasn't successful in pointing to a solution that I see. I was very moved by the trailer from Susan's movie, so thank you for making it. And I understood that in answer to another question, you said you plan to expand on it and show it and start discussions. Do you have any more concrete ideas for how to go from showing a movie to actually closing this divide?
Thank you. That's, and anybody who wants to be involved in this, I hope you'll let me know. This is really a wonderful first step. This is the first public conversation I've had about this project in any way, and it's very exciting to me. And I am just committed to keeping doing this. So we may work with some schools. I feel like if you start talking to children, they grow up very quickly. And what kind of messages are they getting about war? War is often glorified. There are video games. You see the ads for the military services. It looks very glamorous. There's a lot of great hardware. I think there should be other messages as well, and I think we should all be good consumers and participants in government. And if there's anyone in the military here who wants to give your thoughts about this, I would welcome that. I don't know all the next steps. I know we're having a lot of great conversations, raising visibility. I welcome anyone to help with this, and I am getting a very, very good reaction. For example, I've talked to probably a dozen military support organizations, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them. They're wonderful. They provide services for returning veterans, for their families, everything you can imagine, from giving them pets to help with PTSD, to music camps, to grief camps. And so many have said to me, when you make your film, we want to link to it on our website because that will show what we're talking about. So I'm enjoying so much these wonderful people who are working so hard to help the veterans of our country, and they need help. These organizations need help. And I would say one thing you could think to do is volunteer at one of those organizations. You'd really get to know some people and learn something. So any final thoughts?
Okay, well, let me just add that I think developing a deeper understanding between in the relationship between the civilians and the military. I mean, I was most moved today in listening to Seth about the nuance that he brought to it, that he shared with us, the stories of, the thinking that was really not, was more stereotypical thinking that we in the civilian community engage in about them, about the military. So I think just creating an opportunity for a deeper understanding, whether it's through dialogue, whether it's through more community service. I mean, I don't know, but I've been following Susan here since the beginning, and I can't tell you that, I learned a lot today from you, and the power of those images. I think this is something that we can really focus in on, because the power of those images, I mean, this is why the media, this is why we're doing a seminar on the media and conflict resolution, because I think your images are going to speak way louder than any discussion that we could have here. So I can't thank you enough for your work, and I'm just so proud to be your friend. Thank you. And let's thank her.